Imagine this: a Tuesday night, a casual comment, and suddenly the air shifts. The person you're speaking with, maybe a friend, a partner, a coworker, goes still. Their gaze drifts, their responses shorten, or they just stop talking. The anger you might expect isn't there, not outwardly. Instead, there's a wall of silence. This isn't just a momentary pause, it's a complete emotional retreat, a common yet deeply confusing reaction to feeling hurt. It leaves millions of us wondering what just happened and what does that silence actually mean? It turns out the quiet isn't a simple reaction. It's a complex array of coping mechanisms, fears, and even subconscious brain responses. For years, the default assumption was that withdrawal meant disinterest or passive aggression. But the science paints a far more nuanced picture. We've explored the latest research to understand this phenomenon, and we found 10 powerful psychological reasons why people go quiet when they're hurt. Understanding these can entirely change how you navigate your most important relationships. The amygdala's freeze response. When confronted with a perceived threat, our brains have an ancient built-in response: fight, flight, or freeze. This isn't just for physical danger. Emotional pain can also trigger this primal system. The amygdala, a small almond-shaped region deep within the brain, plays a central role in processing emotions, especially fear and stress. When overwhelmed by intense emotional stimuli, the amygdala can activate the freeze response, making it difficult to articulate thoughts or feelings. You might feel a sudden inability to speak, a physical tightening, or a mental blankness. For example, someone receiving unexpected harsh criticism at work might physically shut down, unable to respond, not because they lack an answer, but because their brain's alarm system has taken over. It's an involuntary self-preservation mechanism. However, this freeze isn't always complete paralysis. It can manifest as subtle withdrawal, emotional numbing, or a temporary dissociation from the conversation rather than a full physical stop. Conflict avoidance. Many individuals develop a deep-seated tendency to sidestep disagreements, a behavioral pattern known as conflict avoidance. This often stems from a desire to maintain harmony, a fear of negative repercussions, or a learned belief that confrontation is inherently destructive. Research on conflict resolution styles consistently shows that some people prioritize preserving relationships at almost any cost, even their own voice. For instance, in a family discussion about holiday plans, a person might stay silent and agree to something they secretly dislike, simply to prevent an argument. The fear isn't just about the fight itself, but about the potential damage to the relationship or the intense discomfort of high-tension emotions. While conflict avoidance can sometimes be adaptive in minor, low-stakes situations, allowing for smoother social interactions, it can become highly damaging in close relationships where important issues are left unaddressed, leading to festering resentment and unresolved problems. Fear of vulnerability. Going quiet can be a profound expression of the fear of vulnerability. This psychological barrier prevents individuals from openly sharing their true feelings, thoughts, and needs, often rooted in past experiences where emotional openness led to rejection, ridicule, or pain. When someone has learned that showing their genuine self is unsafe, they instinctively retreat when hurt, believing that further vulnerability will only intensify their suffering. A common example is a partner who, when asked why they are upset, responds with "I'm fine" or simply shrugs, even though their body language screams distress. They fear that explaining their hurt will make them appear weak, be dismissed, or provide ammunition for a future argument. The silence, in this case, is a protective shield. However, it's important to remember that not all silence implies fear. Sometimes it's a deliberate, healthy choice to process emotions internally before engaging, a distinction that can be hard to discern from the outside. Disorganized attachment style. Attachment theory, developed from the work of psychologists like Mary Ainsworth, describes how early experiences with caregivers shape our relationship patterns later in life. A disorganized attachment style often emerges from inconsistent, frightening, or confusing experiences with primary caregivers in childhood. These individuals grow up with a deep conflict. They crave closeness and intimacy, but simultaneously fear it. When hurt, they exhibit contradictory behaviors, wanting comfort but also pushing it away. This can manifest as going quiet, but with an underlying anxiety or agitation. Imagine someone who, after a minor disagreement, retreats into silence, physically turning away from their partner, yet subtly checking their partner's reactions, hoping to be pursued but simultaneously afraid of what that pursuit might entail. It's a profound internal struggle between the desire for connection and the expectation of harm. It's also critical to remember that attachment styles exist on a spectrum and are not rigid diagnoses. They can evolve and be influenced by significant adult relationships and therapeutic work. Anxious preoccupied attachment style. Another attachment pattern that can lead to silence when hurt is the anxious preoccupied style. Individuals with this style tend to have a strong, often overwhelming, desire for intimacy and closeness, coupled with a deep fear of abandonment or rejection. When they feel hurt or threatened in a relationship, their silence isn't necessarily about pushing others away, but rather a potent, albeit indirect, signal of distress designed to draw their partner closer. They might go quiet as a way to test their partner's love, hoping the partner will notice their withdrawal, inquire about it, and offer reassurance. Consider someone who stops texting back after a perceived slight, not to end the conversation, but to see if their friend will worry and reach out first, proving their care. The silence is a desperate bid for attention and validation. While often linked to early childhood experiences, significant adult relationships and life events can also reinforce or shift an individual's attachment patterns over time, demonstrating the dynamic nature of these styles. The misinterpretation of silence. One of the most challenging aspects of someone going quiet when hurt is the profound misinterpretation it often creates. What the withdrawing person intends as self-protection, a need for space, or even a desperate call for understanding, is frequently perceived by others as anger, indifference, punishment, or a lack of care. This communication gap can escalate conflict rather than resolve it. For example, a person might retreat into silence to process overwhelming emotions, needing time to gather their thoughts before speaking. Their partner, however, might interpret this silence as a cold shoulder, a refusal to engage, or even a passive-aggressive attempt to control the situation, leading them to feel rejected and withdraw themselves. This creates a vicious cycle. While it is true that silence can sometimes be used manipulatively, often with holds and passive aggression, the internal intent of the quiet person is usually far more complex and less malicious than it appears from the outside. Understanding this difference is crucial for empathy. Emotional flooding. Sometimes going quiet isn't a choice at all, but an involuntary shutdown caused by emotional flooding. This occurs when an individual becomes so overwhelmed by intense emotions that their physiological arousal spikes, making rational thought and effective communication impossible. Dr. John Gottman's extensive research on couples has shown that during conflict, a person's heart rate can soar, stress hormones like cortisol flood the system, and their ability to process information effectively diminishes. When flooded, the brain essentially goes offline for complex tasks like nuanced conversation. Imagine someone in a heated argument whose heart pounds, palms sweat, and suddenly they can't string a coherent sentence together. Their silence is a natural, albeit involuntary, response to being physiologically overloaded, a desperate attempt by the body to self-regulate and calm down. The threshold for this flooding varies dramatically between individuals, meaning what might overwhelm one person could be a manageable level of stress for another. The demand-withdraw pattern. One of the most destructive communication dynamics in relationships is the demand-withdraw pattern, a cycle where one partner typically demands engagement, discussion, or change, while the other withdraws by going quiet, avoiding conflict, or emotionally shutting down. This pattern is incredibly self-reinforcing. The more one partner pushes for a conversation, the more overwhelmed and silent the other becomes, and vice versa. Dr. Gottman's longitudinal studies have identified this as a strong predictor of relationship dissatisfaction and even divorce. Picture a scenario where one spouse repeatedly tries to discuss household chores, expressing their frustration. The other spouse, feeling criticized and overwhelmed, retreats to another room or simply stops responding, fueling the first spouse's sense of being unheard. It's crucial to recognize that both partners contribute to this pattern. The withdrawing partner isn't solely to blame. The demanding partner's approach can also escalate the withdrawal, creating a feedback loop of increasing distance and hurt. The power of expressive writing. For those who tend to go quiet when hurt, finding healthy outlets for emotional processing is vital. One powerful and well-researched coping mechanism is expressive writing. Pioneered by psychologist James Pennebaker, this technique involves writing about one's deepest thoughts and feelings surrounding a traumatic or stressful event for a set period, typically 15 to 20 minutes over several days. Studies have shown that expressive writing can lead to significant psychological and even physical health benefits, including reduced anxiety, improved mood, and enhanced immune function. For example, someone who feels deeply hurt by a comment but can't articulate it aloud might process their emotions by journaling about the incident, exploring their feelings of anger, sadness, or confusion. This internal processing helps them to understand their own reactions and can reduce the emotional intensity before they attempt any direct communication. While incredibly beneficial for personal emotional regulation, expressive writing is not a substitute for direct interpersonal communication when relational issues need to be resolved with another person. The challenge of active listening. Understanding why someone goes quiet is only half the battle. The other half is knowing how to respond constructively. This is where the challenge of active listening comes into play, especially when confronted with silence. Active listening is a communication technique that requires the listener to fully concentrate on, understand, respond to, and remember what is being said, including nonverbal cues and, critically, what isn't being said. Instead of pushing a quiet person to talk or filling the silence with accusations, an active listener creates a safe space. This might involve acknowledging their silence without judgment, validating their potential feelings. "It seems like you're really hurting right now," sends expressing a willingness to listen whenever they are ready. For instance, a manager noticing an employee's sudden quietness after a project setback might say, "I see you've gone quiet, and that's okay. I'm here to listen if and when you're ready to talk about what's going on." This approach requires immense patience and a willingness to sit with discomfort, and it might not always yield immediate results, but it builds trust over time. The silence that accompanies hurt is rarely simple. It's a complex tapestry woven from our biology, our past, and our deepest fears. Recognizing this can transform moments of withdrawal into opportunities for profound understanding and connection. Beyond misunderstanding, sometimes silence is a deliberate tactic, the silent treatment. This isn't about processing emotions or needing space. It's an intentional withholding of communication designed to punish, control, or manipulate another person. Psychologists often classify it as a form of passive aggression, where one partner asserts power by denying the other's need for connection and resolution. The mechanism is clear. By cutting off dialogue, the silent party creates anxiety and uncertainty in the other, forcing them to guess what went wrong and often to capitulate simply to restore peace. This tactic can feel incredibly damaging because it strips the recipient of agency and leaves them feeling invisible and powerless. Research from Dr. John Gottman, who extensively studies marital dynamics, identifies the silent treatment as one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, predictive behaviors that signal a high risk of relationship failure. His studies, involving thousands of couples over decades, show that stonewalling, a form of the silent treatment, is a strong indicator of eventual divorce, with his research team achieving 93.6% accuracy in predicting which couples would divorce within 6 years. A 2019 study published in the Journal of Family Communication found that adult children's self-reported silent treatment behaviors were negatively related to their own self-esteem and their satisfaction with their primary parent. Imagine a scenario where, after a disagreement about finances, one spouse, let's call her Sarah, stops speaking to her husband David for 3 days. She answers his questions with monosyllabic grunts, avoids eye contact, and leaves the room when he tries to initiate conversation. Sarah's intent isn't to calm down, it's to make David feel the weight of her displeasure, to push him into taking responsibility for the financial issue in the way she sees fit. David, in turn, feels confused, hurt, and increasingly desperate to break the silence, often leading him to apologize for things he doesn't fully understand, just to end the emotional siege. This cycle, where silence is weaponized, erodes trust and intimacy over time, creating a climate of fear rather than genuine connection. Another powerful driver of silence, distinct from personal fears of vulnerability, emerges in contexts of clear power imbalance, such as the workplace. This is known as self-silencing due to perceived hierarchical threat. Here, individuals go quiet not just to avoid conflict, but to protect their careers, their social standing, or even their job security. The mechanism involves a rational assessment, often subconscious, of the risks associated with speaking up against a superior or a dominant group. The cost of expressing dissent or hurt can be severe, ranging from being overlooked for promotions to outright termination. Consider employees at a large tech company like Google or Meta, where internal surveys on psychological safety have revealed concerns about speaking truth to power. While these companies strive for open cultures, the reality of performance reviews, managerial discretion, and the competitive environment can lead individuals to suppress their genuine feelings. Data from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EEOC, in fiscal year 2023 shows that unlawful retaliation was the most common allegation cited in nearly 60% of all discrimination charges filed. This chilling effect teaches individuals that silence is often the safest path. For instance, an engineer at a defense contractor like Lockheed Martin might feel deeply concerned about a design flaw in a new product, but chooses to remain silent during a team meeting. Their quietness isn't because they lack an opinion or are processing. It's born from a fear that raising a red flag could brand them as a troublemaker, jeopardize their project funding, or even cost them their security clearance. This fear of reprisal is a potent inhibitor of open communication, leading to a silence that can mask critical issues and undermine organizational health, even as it preserves the individual's immediate standing. Sometimes the quiet descends not from external threat, but from a profound internal wound, the sting of shame or guilt. When deeply hurt, especially in a way that challenges one's core identity or moral compass, individuals may go quiet as a means of self-preservation and identity protection. The mechanism here is to retreat from public scrutiny, to hide what feels like a fundamental flaw, and to prevent further exposure or perceived humiliation. Shame, unlike guilt, often focuses on the self, I am bad, rather than the action, I did something bad, rather than the action, I did something bad, leading to an intense desire to disappear. Psychological research consistently shows that shame is a highly isolating emotion, driving individuals inward and making open communication incredibly difficult. A 2021 study on trauma-related shame found that avoidance coping partially accounted for the association between shame and PTSD symptoms, highlighting how individuals may withdraw to manage intense internal pain. Consider a respected coach in a small American town, perhaps someone who has dedicated decades to youth sports like a local Little League manager. If a past ethical lapse, perhaps a minor financial impropriety from years ago, were to resurface and be publicly exposed, this individual might suddenly become intensely quiet. Their withdrawal isn't necessarily anger at the exposure, but rather a profound sense of shame. They might cancel public appearances, stop attending community events, and become unresponsive to phone calls, not because they are planning a defense, but because the perceived damage to their identity as a respected community member feels unbearable. The silence is a shield, an attempt to process the intense internal pain and to protect the remaining fragments of their self-worth from further erosion. This internal struggle, driven by shame, can be an incredibly powerful, albeit isolating, reason for going quiet. Beyond the primal freeze of the amygdala or the physiological shutdown of emotional flooding, sometimes silence stems from sheer cognitive overload and exhaustion. This occurs when the brain is simply unable to process the complexity of the situation, the multitude of factors contributing to the hurt, or the sheer volume of information required to formulate a coherent response. The mechanism isn't emotional paralysis, but mental resource depletion. Our working memory has limited capacity, and when stress heightens, that capacity diminishes further, making complex thought, problem-solving, and articulate communication incredibly difficult. Imagine a small business owner in a Midwestern state, perhaps running a diner, who discovers that their longtime head chef has been embezzling funds for months, leading to a massive financial hole. The owner is not just emotionally devastated, they are also faced with a torrent of complex information, legal implications, accounting discrepancies, staff morale issues, customer loyalty concerns, and the immediate need to keep the business afloat. When a concerned friend asks, "What happened? What are you going to do?" the owner might go utterly silent, not out of anger or emotional shutdown, but because their brain is overwhelmed by the sheer number of variables and the monumental task of piecing together a response. A 2024 study on verbal fluency and cognitive decline noted that increased age was associated with a reduction in semantic fluency, demonstrating how cognitive capacity can impact verbal expression. The silence in this instance is a mental pause, a desperate attempt for the brain to catch up, to sort through the chaos, and to find a starting point for understanding and action. It's a mental exhaustion that makes even simple conversation feel like an insurmountable task. leading to a quiet that signals a temporary incapacitation of rational thought, often compounded by the sheer mental effort needed to cope with complex financial or personal fallout. Subscribe to Impulse, and the next video is waiting for you on screen right now.